How will we power our future? Can we create a healthy and clean economy? Climate One at the Commonwealth Club is at the forefront of the global debate about energy, economy, and the environment. Bringing together the brightest and most provocative leaders of our time, Climate One is the place where big ideas get heard. With thoughtful and insightful discussions on policy, business, science, and culture, Climate One founder Greg Dalton gets to the heart of the matter. It's our future. It's time to come together.
After a fleeting moment atop the national political agenda last year, climate change has been eclipsed by the global pandemic. Still, a recent poll from Yale found that public engagement on climate change is at or near historic levels. But will that matter when people vote? The Environmental Voter Project asserts that many people who say they care about climate and the environment don't actually cast ballots. And when talking to pollsters, they lie and say they did vote. Joining us for a conversation on climate and the election are Vanessa Auck, journalist and senior correspondent at Noticias Telemundo, Jeff Nesbitt, executive director at Climate Nexus, and Nathaniel Stinnett, founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project. And in the second half of our show, we'll discuss how racism and policing reforms amid a global pandemic affects the opinions of voters nationally and closer to home. The 2020 elections, today on Climate One. But Nathaniel Stinnett, a lot of your work is that environmentalists lie about their voting record. They may say they care about climate, but they lie to pollsters when about actually voting.
Yeah, so it's interesting, and the way you frame it is accurate, but I think there might be a nicer way to think about it than, oh, these people are lying, although you're absolutely right. And that is that even people who don't vote want to be thought of as good voters. It's really interesting. We have a lot of very strong societal norms in America, just like any culture has strong societal norms. Most people want to be thought of as smart. Most people want to be thought of as nice or honest. One societal norm that our research has uncovered and other behavioral researchers have uncovered is that everybody or almost everybody wants to be thought of as a good voter, even people who don't vote. So for voter mobilization organizations like us at the Environmental Voter Project, this is actually an extraordinarily powerful tool. If we know that even non-voting environmentalists want to be thought of as good voters, well, then we can leverage that and to get them to vote more often. Because I hope we'll get a chance to discuss this later on, but just as Jeff and Tony have mentioned that the number of Americans who deeply care about climate is rising pretty significantly and pretty quickly, there is also this enormous population of non-voting environmentalists. And if we're able to actually get them out to the polls, that can have an enormous impact politically, but also on policymaking.
So you're trying to change the electorate, not change elections. Where are these, Nathaniel Stinnett, where are these non-voting environmentalists? What states are they in?
Yeah. Well, first, let's just talk about some numbers here. 10.1 million already registered to vote environmentalists stayed home for the 2016 presidential election. 10.1 million. And these people care so deeply about climate and the environment that it's their number one priority. So this is a huge number. Now, as far as how they are distributed, they are much more likely to be in the New South or the Southwest than they are to be in the Rust Belt. And part of that is for strong demographic reasons. When we talk about environmentalists, and in particular, people who care so deeply about climate and the environment that it's their number one priority, these people are far more likely to make less than $50,000 a year, be African American, Latinx, or Asian American. And as Jeff mentioned, they tend to be younger rather than older. And so that's why in these states that I mentioned, you have very large populations of these demographic groups that I just mentioned.
Vanessa Auck, there were in 2016, about half of the 27 million eligible Hispanic voters did not vote. This time around, there's 32 million eligible Hispanic voters, the largest voting bloc, quite a significant thing. What do we know about whether they're actually going to turn out to vote? If 50% of them or more will vote this time?
Yes, I mean, this is historic for us, for our Latino community. We're very excited about these numbers. Before I talk about it, I wanted to mention that, of course, with everything that is happening with the pandemic, with the the situation with our economy, 40 million people that are unemployed, you might think, okay, climate is not going to be a big issue in this election, but I think it's the complete opposite, because this pandemic has made us stop. I mean, everything stopped for the past 3 months, and this has given us time to reflect. And I think two things have come out of this that are very, very clear. The number one is that we have realized how fragile we are as a society. We never thought that something like this could happen to us, and it did. And number two, we are realizing that that we have a terrible relationship with nature, an unsustainable relationship with nature, that we're taking and not respecting the boundaries of our ecosystems. So I think people are listening and are reflecting that we are doing something wrong, and that we need to change. Because if we don't, the next pandemic is going to be around the corner. And if we don't, we're going to be facing the worst consequences of climate change. As for the Latino community, they are the most affected. Minorities are disproportionately affected by climate change. African Americans, Latinos. So my community knows that this is an important issue because it's very real to them. I mean, it affects them when they go to work, because they work a lot outside in the agricultural business, in landscaping, and we're having more and more heat waves. It affects them because they live in the communities that are more polluted in the country, and their children suffer for asthma 40% more times than the children for any other ethnic groups. So this is something that is extremely real for our community, and I think we just need to give them the knowledge and the platform for them to act on climate, and that's what I do as a journalist, and at Telemundo we just give them the right information and empower them to go out and vote, because this is the most powerful tool that we have. Our vote is our voice, and I'm truly hoping that this election is going to be different.
Nathaniel, you pointed out an article by David Roberts in Vox, I think, about tribal epistemology, which, the idea that what the tribe we're a part of determines how we see issues. So let's talk a little bit about, you touched on it earlier, tribal identity is really going to drive this issue, who we are. We're in such a tribal situation right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly in modern American history, but even before our generation, we have often viewed American politics along one axis, and that is an ideological axis. You're either liberal or conservative or somewhere in between. And not just in the United States, but also in Western Europe, we're seeing some really significant shifts now. And I'm not saying ideology has disappeared, but there is an alternate axis, and maybe even a more dominant axis, upon which people identify themselves politically. And that has much more to do with what tribe they are a part of. And you really have a group of people who are trusting experts and who buy into cross-cultural objective truths and promote egalitarianism. Whereas on the other side, you often have people who, rather than trusting experts, trust the will of the people. They often define truths from within their tribe, and that's what David Roberts is getting at with this idea of tribal epistemology. And rather than promoting egalitarianism, they promote more individual freedom. And this cuts across party lines. I think it's enormously important for people to begin understanding that what it means to have a D next to your name and what it means to have an R next to your name, I don't want to say is unimportant, but it's a lot less important. Donald Trump held a rally outside of El Paso in 2018, where I think 45% of the people who showed up were registered Democrats. Party affiliation is not as strong an indicator as it used to be. And there are a lot of other axes upon which, populist versus authoritarian, trusting objective truth rather than tribal truth, things like that people are now defining themselves by. And it's enormously important. And we're seeing it with the coronavirus pandemic right now. I mean, there hasn't been a lot of great polling on it, but what little polling there has been, we're seeing, I mean, the people who are wearing masks are the same people who care deeply about climate change. And there's now this sort of basic lens through which a whole bunch of issues are being viewed. And it'll be really interesting to see how various issues serve as proxies for other issues over the next 5 months. Because my guess is the people who really deeply care about public health and are taking experts' advice and coronavirus precautions seriously probably pretty cleanly align with people who care deeply about addressing the climate crisis.
Jeff Nesbitt, is the Koch network playing as big a role? Are they still spending as much money on obstructing climate progress? They've been very dominant in this country in the political right, the funding infrastructure they put in place. You have some views on the state of the Koch network?
Yeah, I do. I've written a book about that called Poison Tea from before. But before I get to that, I want to encourage Vanessa, because I'll make a prediction first. Suburban moms in the Latino community will determine whether Donald Trump gets a second term or not. I'll just say that flat out. They will be the deciding factor in this coming election. I'll just say that bluntly. And second, your reporting, your network's reporting, Univision and others, is going to be absolutely essential. Donald Trump has run 2 campaigns now on the concept of Lügenpresse, which was a term that was used in Nazi Germany called lying press. It's a tactic to convince millions of people that the media is lying to them. And
I know.
And they're running, they'll spend $1 billion on social media platforms that's built around basically raw propaganda. Communities have to be able to trust the media coverage around critical issues like climate change and others. So I really, really hope that the people who listen to your broadcasts will pay attention to what you're reporting on, because it's critically important. Now, to get to your answer about the Koch network, I actually was on a private call with the head of the Koch network's new foundation called Stand Together. There's been an interesting discussion among some of the younger lieutenants in the Koch network. And even around an issue like climate change, they are recognizing that quite possibly they may have made a mistake in how they have gone after the Republican Party on some of these issues. The younger leadership in the Koch network may be prepared for sort of a sea change politically.
Racism, police, and the pandemic are dominating hearts and headlines, but will they translate to votes in national and regional elections? One study found wavering Trump voters rank immigration and environment as top reasons for possibly changing their vote, but it's unclear if that will materialize. Here for a conversation about power in the elections are Tiffany Cross, journalist and author of Say It Louder, Black Voters, White Narratives, and Saving Our Democracy, Republican political strategist Rick Wilson, and Rich Thau, who is leading focus groups with Obama-Trump voters in swing states. Tiffany, let's begin with you. Will the 2020 election be determined by swing voters in battleground states or turning out the Democratic and Republican bases?
Definitely, I think the latter. I think anybody who's still laser focused on swing voters is operating from a playbook of yesteryear. I question even this whole theory of swing voters. I think if somebody is still on the fence at this point about who to vote for, then they are emphatically not a swing voter. I do think there are people, we have to look at it through the lens of this is not a choice between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, but a choice between Joe Biden or stay home for a lot of people. So I think with all the attention that you hear in the media landscape that's focused on swing voters, it feels a bit out of step. It feels like a political playbook from 20 years ago. And perhaps if we paid attention to the voting trends of midterms, that we would know that swing voters do not necessarily determine presidential outcomes.
Rick Wilson, Donald Trump has never shown an interest in growing his base, and his support has never exceeded 50% of the American people. Bill Kristol recently tweeted, quote, "You look at the polls and think he can't win, but Trump's path to victory doesn't depend on persuading Americans. It depends on voter suppression, mass disinformation, foreign interference, and unabashed use of executive branch power to shape events and perceptions." Do you agree with Bill Kristol?
All those things are correct. Those are all correct answers from what Bill said. And And it is a moment where you have to look at the electoral map as it is. This is a battle in the electoral college. It is not a national election at all. I know how California is going to vote. I know how Alabama is going to vote. I know how Washington State is going to vote, and I know how Arkansas is going to vote. These are not states that are in play. So the model of swing states still exists. In those swing states, we have places that moved from, remarkably, Obama to Trump. We have voter pools in states like Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, North Carolina, Arizona, and Florida, where there are a meaningful number of voters who inexplicably moved from Obama to Trump. And in 2018, they moved from Trump to Democrats. So it's really not a matter of swing voters as a pool nationally. It is a matter of that these particular states on the electoral college map have a much different set of impetuses and character than you might think with the big blue or the big red states. So when I look at a place like Michigan, I see a pool of voters where suburban female voters in Oakland and Macomb County outside of Detroit who went for Donald Trump, they held their nose in 2016 and voted for Donald Trump. In 2018, they said, no more. I can't handle this. I don't want my kids growing up watching this kind of person. So they voted against Trump's enablers from Congress. They voted against Republican candidates down the ticket because they could. Now, those folks are going to be back in play this year. Some will be pulled to the tribal necessities of our politics because both sides, and Tiffany's right, we have two intense party bases in this country. Some will be pulled back to that intense Republican base. Some will be pulled back to that intense Democratic base. But they are identifiable through survey research, polling, focus groups, data analysis, voter file analysis. We are with the Lincoln Project, we're digging into that. And this is a game of small numbers. Look, the president won election in 3 states by 77,000 votes. He won Florida, a state with 20 million people in it, by 150,000 votes. So going out there and hunting down these small pools of persuadables is critical because we're in an electoral college game. That game is not about the popular vote. That game is not about the national mood. That is about going into a place like Florida and flipping 150,000 votes, or a place like Michigan and flipping 70 or 30,000 votes, or a place like Wisconsin flipping 43,000 votes. So all these places that were narrow adventures in 2018 or 2016, we saw that in a lot of those places they were former Obama states and voters. We got to flip them back, and we've got to keep them away from Trump in 20.
Rich Thau, you've been talking to these people for 15 months, swing voters. Who are they? Where are they? What's a profile? What do they think?
It's a great question. So it's been a fascinating exercise, crisscrossing the upper Midwest for a year, and then now the last few months doing it via Zoom. And I'll tell you, there are a few characteristics that stand out about these swing voters. The first thing is I would describe them as serial presidential monogamists. They fell in love with Bush. After 8 years, they fell out of love and fell in love with Obama. They loved Obama for 8 years, fell out of love with him, and loved Trump. And for me, the question is, are they on a 4-year trajectory or an 8-year trajectory? The second thing I'd say is that not all, but a sizable number are what you'd call classic low information voters. They get their news from local news sources, local TV, local websites. The majority are not getting it from CNN, MSNBC, or Fox. So what they know about what's going on in the wider world, wider policy conversation is actually quite limited. Most of them have never heard of the Green New Deal, for example. So as we think about who they are, we have to understand that their personalities are such that they're not driven by policy as much as they're driven also by personalities, and they're driven by a desire for change. They're sort of perpetually dissatisfied. They start off satisfied, the satisfaction wanes, and it wanes to the point where they're looking to take on something new. There's always a classic, are they Coke or are they Pepsi? They're both. They like both kinds of soda. They can vote for a D or vote for an R, depending upon who attracts them more. It's not a matter of either or, it's an and they just have to decide which one is more attractive.
Rick Wilson, you're spending lots of money with other Republicans against Donald Trump, but is there a risk that you're not going to excite people? You might turn people off and they won't vote. They're not going to get excited about Biden?
Well, this campaign runs in basically 3 columns. The first column is what we do very, very well, which is keep Donald Trump personally off balance. We make sure that Donald Trump never has a good night's sleep. We make sure that Donald Trump is watching our Twitter feed 24 hours a day. He knows there's going to be something new coming down the pike at him all the time. As somebody put it to me, imagine you were running through the woods and there's always a chance a wolf is going to come out and take a nip out of you at any moment. So we're the wolves in this equation, and Donald Trump, he can't escape us. So that'll run through the campaign. We're also prosecuting the case against Donald Trump because from our research, we've seen that there are voters who may dislike him, may think he's doing a bad job sort of generically, but we've now got things like COVID where there is a price tag in terms of lives and in terms of our economy. And we're going to articulate that in the ways that as former Republicans, we're very skilled at. We're going to focus that very, very fine set of tools we've developed over a long period to communicate that message to voters so they really have a clear choice, that it's not just a partisan question, that it is a demonstration of how incompetent and corrupt and unstable Donald Trump is. And the final part of this will be more persuasion. There will be more uplift. That's going to be much later in the process, though, because for right now, there's a value added to this to keeping Donald Trump's numbers in the 40 and sub 40 range. That prohibits him from getting a big lift under his wings. That prohibits him from getting to takeoff speed. That prevents him from starting to deploy the resources that he's been raising in a smart way. We've been making them burn money in all kinds of places because they are undisciplined and they can't change that. That is the character of their candidate and their campaign.
Rich Thau, I want to get to climate and environment, because while there's this cycle is engaging, we have these macro issue of climate change. Do swing voters you're talking to, do they care about the climate? Do they care about the environment? Where does that rank in terms of issues, Rich Thau?
It's a great question. So I've been asking about climate and environmental issues throughout the entirety of the project. A couple things stand out. The first is that climate change is not a top tier issue for these swing voters. It kind of falls in the middle between not being a hoax and not being an emergency. Basically, it's kind of a problem that's out there. So if you ask people, is it your number one issue? No one's going to say it's their number one issue, but a number of them will put it in their top 5, but it's not 1 or 2. The thing that we uncovered, to me, that is the most interesting, and I think from a campaign perspective, looking at it from Biden's side, is that when we ask people to evaluate the rollbacks that the Trump administration has advanced in the course of its term, that the folks in our group, were generally did not know about them at all, hadn't heard about them, but when they learned about them, discovered that they were remarkably negative. And we found that when we gave them a list of 17 of these items and had them score them on a scale from 0 to 10 about how much they supported or opposed them, they opposed all 17. And some of them, it scores at like 1, 1.5. Most of them were things related to clean water and clean air, particularly clean water. And when I asked them, if you knew that this was a problem in your neighborhood, how upset would you be? They were off the charts upset. So I think the opportunity potentially, if people in the environmental movement were to seize it, would be to make a case not about the rollbacks in the abstract, but the rollbacks as they affect people in the swing states. And if you can point to a specific rollback that undermine water quality or air quality where these people live and say that's because of Donald Trump or the Trump administration, that would be very powerful, because it would be a way to tie the things that they don't like about the president to something that affects them personally.
Yep. Tiffany Cross, I know we're wrapping up the end here. There's also generational change happening here. We've talked a fair amount about race. Eliot Engel, chair of the House Foreign Relations Committee, been in Congress for 30 years, facing a tough race from Jamal Bowman, former middle school principal in the Bronx, first-time candidate. Charles Booker is, challenging the establishment. Candidate, former Marine combat pilot at Amy McGrath in Kentucky. Tell us about sort of the generational fissures you're seeing here.
Yeah, I think that's such an issue. And, Rick, I was listening to you talk about some of the things that Democrats do wrong. And I found myself agreeing with a lot of what you said, because, to your question, Greg, I think there is the issue that some of these members die in their seats, and it's like you have to groom somebody to pick up the mantle and take the next step. And I'm disappointed that I don't see a lot of that happening. And there's also, even when it comes to widening the voting electorate, I mean, there are definitely spaces where Democrats benefit from keeping the electorate narrow, because that will bring in new voter base, younger voters who may not be as loyal to incumbent candidates. So look, this is time for introspection on all sides about what we can do to reimagine America and be the collective architects on what this next phase of government looks like. And I think it certainly says something that Charlie Booker came on the scene after being shunned by people in the Beltway, and he built this groundswelling in Kentucky by being progressive. And, there are these progressive pockets of the South. So maybe Alabama isn't woke, but Birmingham most certainly is. Maybe Georgia isn't woke, but Atlanta most certainly is. So I think there are pockets where there is space for younger, more progressive candidates to find their pathway. And then perhaps energize a new base of voters who, like I said, these younger voters, as we saw with the TikTok users and the Trump campaign, it's easy to dismiss that as a prank, but that was activism. That is young people saying, we do not like the direction of this country, and we may not be old enough to vote, but we want to make our voice heard and shame people who are elevating and supporting this man who aims to destroy everything about our democracy. So I hope to see a sea change in some of the newer, younger voters, and I hope that it pushes Democrats to think a little more innovatively about how they run campaigns. I think Rick actually made some really good points about how that goes.
Podcasts of this and other Climate One shows are available wherever you get your pods. Please help us get more people talking about climate by telling a friend. It really does help. Our thanks to our fantastic panel today, and thanks to you, our audience, joining us live. We'll see you next time, everybody.